Hello and welcome to More to the Story. I am so glad that you have tuned in because we are going to have another great podcast for you today. We have a very special guest, which we will introduce here in a little bit. But first of all, I want to welcome my fabulous co host, Mary Browning. We're so glad that you're here helping me and taking up the slack. And I appreciate you so much in helping out with this. And I do want to remember our dear friend, Joyce Zunis Brown, who was the national director for Operation Outcry for many years, a voice for the unborn. She also served on the advisory committee for Operation Outcry, and she helped get this podcast set up for us. She gave us valuable information, all the while battling cancer.
Yes.
And the Lord took her home on a glorious day, on Easter Day. He took her home. And we want to dedicate this podcast and all of ours for the remaining of the month of April, which is Abortion Awareness Month, Abortion Recovery Awareness Month. And so we want to just be sure and let our viewers know that we're dedicating it to our beautiful sister who we loved and surely miss in this world. And Mary, do you want to give our disclaimer?
Yes, thank you, Molly. So good to be on the show with you today. We do want to mention that this topic is a topic that is not for tender and young ears. So if you have children around, you may want to distract them or do something so they don't hear the content. This will include information about abortion and particularly abortion harm. So we do look forward to you listening and wanted you to know that you won't want your children near.
Amen. And it might be a little triggering. We're going to be talking about how abortion hurts women and men. And so if you've had an abortion in your past and you haven't gone through healing, you haven't dealt with it, then we will put on the screen, there's a helpline number that you can call, and they will hook you up to an abortion recovery program. We strongly recommend that for everyone who's had an abortion, because we can really hide that trauma and that pain, but it comes out in our behaviors, it comes out in our decision makings, it comes out in the way we feel about ourselves. So we want to encourage you. And if you're pregnant and not sure what to do, of course, we want you to choose life. It's always the best solution. And if you need help, there's always pregnancy resource centers in every area that would come along and help you through your pregnancy and even afterwards. So reach out to a pregnancy resource center and let them help you choose life and take care of that baby. We have a very special guest. You know, April is Abortion Awareness, Abortion Trauma, Abortion Recovery Awareness Month. There, I got it. And every one of our guests have been either leaders of the abortion recovery ministries. And today we have a very special guest. It's Dr. Priscilla Coleman. And I actually met Dr. Coleman years ago. I was told about her and I invited her to come speak at a United Nations event that we were hosting. And we wanted to educate women from all around the world how abortion does hurt women, the trauma that we experience afterwards, so that they could go back and educate their women and choose life, you know, keep this from happening in their own countries. Dr. Coleman is a developmental psychologist and retired professor of human development and family studies at Bowling Green State University. She has published over 60 peer-reviewed journal articles, the majority which relate to abortion decision making and mental health outcomes. And I'm just going to stop there and welcome Dr. Coleman to the show, and she can bring some more of her expertise into the discussion. So welcome, Dr. Coleman.
Thank you, Molly and Mary. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're so excited, and thank goodness for podcasts, right? You know, we don't have to travel across the country to put on something that's educational and informational. So, but let's start out. I know you are an expert in abortion decisions and abortion outcome on mental health, but can we just kind of briefly talk about maternal bonding and then into the decision making and the outcome? Can you do that for us?
Sure. The research on maternal fetal bonding has been part of the professional literature for decades. And so there's strong evidence that indicates very early in pregnancy, women start to feel those emotional attachments, the affiliation to the fetus. They start to experience maternal emotions. And there's an interesting study that was conducted in Australia I think it's around 1996. So it's been quite a while. And these researchers, Allinson and Asbury, did a survey of women who were about to undergo a first trimester abortion. So all fully intending to abort, and large percentages experienced bonding emotions, even though they were not planning to have the baby. They rubbed their stomachs. They felt they talked to the baby. And so it was amazing to see that just the physiological process, the biological process that was proceeding despite the woman's intention not to become a mother. So we do know that that attachment has a physiological basis, that it's a psychological basis, and so when abortion is chosen, that's abruptly um, ended. And then, of course, there can be grief and guilt, all sorts of adverse emotions that will likely impact them later. Um, After often it's around the time that they would have given birth, or when they have children in the future and they're examining, basic information on fetal development that might bring up the prior abortion experience. So we do know that women feel connected oftentimes. Another study indicated that only 8% of women don't experience this emotional connection during pregnancy.
Hmm. And
So,
could that be based on some kind of prior trauma, prior
well,
history?
it could be, or it could be the complexity of their lives. That they just are not in tuned, or emotionally free to experience it. We don't know. I don't think those 8% of women have been examined or dissected, but there are a lot of possibilities. Some people are just a little um, less oriented to children, or to their less in tune with their bodies. There's just a lot of reasons.
Okay.
I think I've done a little bit of work on women who have been trapped in sex trafficking, and their lives are so horrendous that they often have repeat abortions. But that's only part of the story. They're being raped all day long. I mean, so how much somebody can attend to some of these maternal experiences really depend on their life circumstances. That's obviously an extreme example, but
Doctor, can you tell us about your work with the decision making for a woman in that process?
sure. Um, well, for most women, the majority of women don't approach a reproductive decision like that in a callous way, or in a uninformed way. Most view it as a very serious decision. Um, there are examples of women in the literature who have had multiple abortions, but the majority of women who have an abortion, they've had one or two. So once they've had one, they typically will prevent the circumstances. But it's often difficult because when abortion is sort of on the table in terms of women's choices, they're often in a relationship that may not be going anywhere. They might be being pressured to abort by parents or boyfriends. So there's a whole context of those decisions. And approximately 30% who arrive at an abortion clinic are still ambivalent. They're not sure. And so they're going to be looking to people they interact with for information and direction. And sadly, they often don't get that. Oftentimes, you'll see in the literature, or you'll hear that women know what they want when they arrive there. They don't need that information. They just want to get their abortion and move on. But it's just not true. It's a difficult decision for most women, and there's a lot of people that in most women's lives who try to influence in one direction or another. So, and on top of that, when we're in a sort of a crisis situation dealing with a difficult decision, our abilities to process information are not as effective. We're kind of in crisis mode, hoping to get through it quickly. And so what happens is women may make that decision without their full faculties. And then afterwards, when sort of their brains come back or when things calm down, that's when they really feel the pain of the abortion.
Amen.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that piece of this, but I have had a law practice for about 20 years. And that's one of the things I was always grateful when someone brought someone else with them when they came to talk to me, because that other person would hear what I had to say, and remember it better than the person that was actually sort of in the crisis place. So I hadn't really thought about that piece, about not hearing what's being said, not being able to internalize it.
Yeah, and sadly, a lot of women hide this. So there's shame and guilt, and they don't want people to know. So a lot of women will go to the clinic by themselves. They don't have someone there to help process.
And I thought it was very interesting when you said they were in a crisis mode when they go into that clinic. Mm-hmm. And I never really thought about that a whole lot. I know I went in looking for information alone and did not get the facts. And so like you were saying, we kind of rely on the information and the people around us. But still, I wasn't 100% committed to that decision, even though I went through with it.
Right, exactly.
But I don't know if I felt I was in a crisis mode. I probably was. I just didn't see it that way. But let me ask you this, Dr. Coleman. You were talking about how some women already are starting to bond with their children, even though they know they're going to have an abortion. And I know women who have, they would see their baby on the ultrasound, or they talk to their child or ask their child for forgiveness. Does that have a more of an impact on her emotionally than, us going in thinking, they tell me it's just a tiny dot of cells, and then later finding out that about fetal development at that time we had the abortion. So is there a difference?
Well, definitely. Women who do feel that emotional connection, and women who see that the fetus as a human being, so feeling that attachment, the bonding, the closeness to the baby, knowing that is a human being. If a woman answers affirmatively to questions like that, after the abortion, she's much more likely to be traumatized. That is one of the most well-established risk factors for adverse outcomes, feeling that attachment to the child. And it's not like you feel it or you won't feel it. There's levels of attachment. Some will feel slight affiliative emotions. Some will feel, very strong emotions, especially if they've had babies previously. So women who have abortions after carrying to term are going to be more aware of the sensations, and they're going to be more prone to bonding. So that's another difficult situation. Also, with adolescents, they typically or oftentimes will hide their pregnancy. So then the baby has developed more, maybe kicking. They're going to really experience the life of that child. And then we do know that adolescents, compared to older women, are more likely to have psychological trauma post-dating the experience.
I didn't know that. Can you tell us about that a little bit more?
About the adolescents, or
yes.
Yeah, well, in the case of adolescents, developmentally, their brains haven't fully developed, so they're going to be prone to pressure, and we know that pressure or coercion to abort also increases risk of psychological problems. They're going to have more advanced gestational age pregnancies because of that tendency to deny and hide.
Yep. We kind of lost her there, Terrence.
She's frozen up.
She froze up a little bit, so I'm sure she'll be back in just a second.
See, am I back? Oh.
You're back, yes.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. I live way out in the middle of nowhere, so this happens once in a while.
Yeah,
so with adolescents being more vulnerable to post-abortion psychological problems, it's based on several factors. They often have later gestational age abortions because they are in denial that they're pregnant. They might not realize they're pregnant. They may not have regular periods anyway. So there may be, it may be unknown. So they may, and so it could be later because they're hiding it, or just they can't decide. They may want the baby, but they're feeling pressure from a boyfriend or a parent. So they're more likely the recipients of pressure and coercion, and they're also more likely to be undecided themselves and kind of lean toward having the baby, but it doesn't feel like a viable option at their age, and they're fearful that may derail their plans to go to college, or they may be involved in their church, and they don't want to put their parents through the embarrassment. I mean, there's just so many elements that surround a decision to abort during adolescence that are not similar with women who are over 18.
Thank you.
I was going to ask a question about is there a difference between some of the psychological outcomes that a teenager might experience as opposed to an adult woman? Are they all the same? And can you go through some of those psychological trauma symptoms?
Well, we do know that the adolescents are more likely to experience a range of psychological outcomes. And the ones that we know the most about are, we know it's linked with depression. We know it's linked with anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, phobias, social anxiety, all forms of anxiety. We know one of the strongest outcomes we see that's most consistent across studies internationally is the link with substance abuse. And so that might apply to adolescents particularly because it's a way of coping without having to tell anybody, that you've had the abortion. It's, you don't have to go to a doctor or a therapist and say, I'm suffering from depression because of this experience. But instead, they may start just taking, pills or drinking to self-medicate. So we do see a very strong association between abortion across all ages and substance abuse, particularly, most likely, particularly with adolescents. And then another outcome that we see is increased risk for suicidal thoughts or ideation and suicidal behaviors, attempts or completed suicide. I served as an expert in the case, I believe the trial was around in 2010, 11. It's been a while, but Stacy Zally was a young woman who was pressured into an abortion by her boyfriend and the father, and she committed her suicide by hanging in her home, and that it was not her choice. She began drinking, and so there were substance abuse issues, and then the suicide. And she had no prior psych history. She just wanted to be a mom. After her, after the trial was complete, and there was evidence of a suicide note that we used, but indicating she just wanted to be with her unborn baby. It was pretty clear why she took her own life. And for that case, I calculated the number of suicides in the United States that are directly attributable to abortion. And it's anywhere, depending on the method you use, anywhere between about 45 and 200 suicides in the United States are directly related to abortion.
Wow. Wow. That's so
But
sad.
one of the things that struck me, Doctor, when you began talking about that was I am not sure that I even connected some of the things that I experienced emotionally with the fact that I'd had an abortion. And I think the fact that I wanted to pretend it hadn't happened, but,
Yeah.
and also the fact that everybody says we should, this is all fine and we don't have anything. Basically, this is all a good thing. It's legal, it's a good thing. And
Hmm.
so I just wonder the extent to which the societal perception or pressure, I'm sorry, um, I don't know if the right word is pressure, but position
Impact.
about abortion, how that factors in to do people actually even sometimes recognize that the trouble they're having is connected.
Well, I'm sure some people don't make that connection. And the, sort of another aspect of this is with society telling women that this is nothing. You know, you should do what's right for you, what's right for the child, have a child later when you're ready, and all that stuff. A woman might begin to feel there's something wrong with her because she is sad about the abortion and she regrets the abortion, but the professionals are all saying that, you know, this is nothing. So then on top of the trauma is that maybe some compromised self-esteem, self-doubt. They lose, you know, a sense that their decisions are appropriate, or you know. So there's all kinds of like psychological stuff that comes along with the message from the culture being so different from what women experience.
The reality. Mhm.
Because we are told there's no problems. You know,
Yeah, but
you
that's
go into
not
the
work.
abortion.
I don't
Yeah.
think that's working anymore. To
I
tell you the truth, because there have been so many women who have experienced abortion now. What are we up to? 50 million abortion? I don't even know the numbers
over
right.
60, I believe. Now,
Six-
now,
63
now
million.
with Roe being overturned, the
We
kennel
don't know.
we don't even know because they don't have to
Exactly.
report that.
Well, and you just can't hide the pain of all those women. And, you know, and there's a lot, so many more speaking out like both of you are. I mean, there's just so much. They can't pull that anymore. I don't think as readily. So,
Well, they probably still do in the abortion clinics. I don't know if they've
yeah.
changed that story.
But
You know, oh, there's no, you know, trauma. If there is, then, you know, there's something wrong with you. You know,
but
Yeah.
it's
it
not
is
because of the abortion; it's because of something else.
Right.
it, it is part of the reason why we are doing more to the story, the podcast, more to the story,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that people hear the whole story. I was in a meeting last Friday, so that was just a few days ago,
Mhm.
and well, almost a week, but and there was a person in the meeting that said they'd never heard about abortion harming women, that they were aware that abortion harms the child, but no one had ever, they'd never ever heard it about a woman being harmed.
Well, that sort of brings up when I first started publishing on this topic, it was very hard to get articles into the journals because it wasn't politically correct information. But then I naively thought, well, now that we have 10, 15, whatever number of articles, the world's going to have to pay attention. But it's ignored. It's just blatantly ignored. And just a few years back, when you looked at the fact sheet, that supposed fact sheet that Planned Parenthood would use, the studies were from the early 90s. I mean, there's just been a blackout on all this literature for a long time. And so that's, you know, part of the reason that in my retirement now, I'm working with Kaylin Carlson, and we've developed a nonprofit. It's the International Institute for Reproductive Loss. But our main goal, our mission is to package this enormous literature so that it can be easily understood by professionals. You know, whoever needs it, the therapists, the doctors, the family members, lawyers, and
World leaders need this. World leaders need to know the impact it's going to have on your society.
yeah, well, one of the most exciting things, that it might sound boring to be doing it, but one of the most exciting things I think that we're doing is we're developing and we've got about a third of it done, an annotated bibliography of all the world literature. So it'll be in a Word document with summaries of every study published. So if you want studies on abortion and rape or abortion in adolescence, you just have to do a word search and then you have the article. Because so many people over the years have contacted me in need of studies on decision making, and it's just, it will be at people's fingertips with this. And we will have PowerPoints and fact sheets, all with the references provided. We're going to publish papers. We're going to help experts defend their studies. I mean, we have a pretty big agenda, but I am so thrilled because all those years trying to keep an academic job, raise children, serve as an expert, I just didn't have time to do this, but I've known of this need. And Kaylin has just been so gracious and wonderful to work with. So we have the website, but we're going to officially launch when there's enough information out there to be useful to people. But that's the whole purpose. Blast this information everywhere so people in meetings will know.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Coleman.
So that reminds me, I like to collect antiques, and I was able to go into a neighbor's home after they passed and go through and get some items. And one of the children born in this home grew and became a doctor. And I found some of the stuff. He had a book that was published in the 1920s about how abortion psychologically traumatizes women.
Wow. I would love to buy that book from you.
I will loan it to you, but it's packed up in a box right now because I'm kind of living in between homes. But when I find it, I'll definitely get that to you. I go searching for it here soon.
Just the title, it might be a bit. Yeah, because it will be interesting to see if back then they really understood. There was a Hemingway. I'm sure they did. It's a universal experience. It wouldn't be bound by time or place, and so I'm sure that it would be similar. There's a short story by Hemingway titled "Hills Like White Elephants." It's all about a couple making a decision to have an abortion, and the man is saying how simple it will be, and the woman is indicating it'll change our lives forever. And so that's a very old story.
Wow. Well, I was going to ask, why do women tend to have severe psychological and emotional trauma after abortion?
Well,
what's the root of all of that?
Well, I think the root of it is they've lost their child, and I can say with kind of authority that that's the main source of the pain. Because we did a qualitative study back in 2012 with CareNet facilities all over the country, and we had a survey online where we asked women. We did the quantitative sort of numerical data collection, but we also asked women what was the worst thing about your abortion, what was most negative, and what were the benefits, what was positive. That paper was published in 2017, I believe. But then these were women who had returned or had decided to attend a post-abortion therapy session. So it's a little bit of a clinical sample. However, like the vast majority said, the worst thing about my abortion was I lost my child, or, I ended the life of my child. It was all about that. Other things too, but that was what floated to the top in terms of what made it's so traumatizing. And interestingly, under the positives, we didn't get, it enabled me to continue my education or get my dream job or any of that. The positives related to becoming involved in the pro-life movement, a deepened relationship with God, being able to help women make a better choice. And so the positives were nothing like what the women's rights movement tells women.
Right. Wow. Right. Wow. That's very interesting, because I would think that there might be some of those in there, like, I was able to advance my career. Or
there were a few. There were some of that, but we looked at the responses that were uttered by the largest numbers of people. We had nearly 1,000 in in that survey. So.
Well, I
Yeah, and
feel that. Go ahead, Molly.
no, go ahead.
I feel your description kind of describes Molly and myself. It describes what we are doing with our decisions too.
Right, right, and it makes so much sense because you can't get your baby back, and you know how much you suffered, and so you don't want other women to suffer as well, and you of course want to save lives too, and it gives life meaning, your life meaning, and I do think in my experiences talking to women and speaking all over the world, literally the testimonies I've heard, it seems like the women who have found God or affirmed their relationship with God and feel forgiven are fine. They are doing fine. They're forgiven, and then they've moved on, and then now they want to contribute to society in this way. So it's really beautiful to see what's happened.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up, Mary, because that is so true. From my personal experience, it took me, I was in something that we could probably talk about, Dr. Coleman, is it took me 13 years to go back and look at those decisions, those abortion experiences. I lived in such denial that they were hurting me, even though I was so wounded. Um, but after going through healing and then meeting other women, that had the same experience and were going through healing, for me, I don't want another woman to suffer that way. It's
Yeah.
long term. I mean, it's long term. Mary and I are a little bit older. I started this about 24 years ago. I was in my 40s, when I started sharing my testimony, but it's because I don't want other women to experience the trauma, the long-term trauma that follows aborting a child. And
Right.
I've had other pregnancy losses. I've had miscarriage. That was traumatizing. I've had 2 stillborn children. That was traumatizing. But having the ability to bury children, through my stillborn children, having that ability to bury them and have a funeral and mourn for them was so much better than losing children through abortion and not
Yeah.
ever having that closure and having that, mourning process and then the guilt associated with that. But I've
Yeah.
had a lot of different pregnancies.
That's a lot of losses, but there is actually some excellent research by Anne Broen, I believe she's in Norway, where she compared women who had losses due to abortion, stillbirth, miscarriage, and she found that initially the level of anxiety and other psychological experiences was similar for women who had abortions and women who had involuntary losses. But then she followed them 5 years out and found that the women who had the natural losses had resolved a lot of the grief and suffering, but the women who had the abortions had the same levels of anxiety and other psychological problems that they had initially. So it wasn't resolved. It was just there. And another thing you mentioned, Molly, was that for 13 years you just kind of ignored it. Well, one effect that I've seen and heard women talk about, like in our qualitative research, but I haven't seen too much really systematic, large scale data on it, is I think a lot of women end up just getting so busy that they don't stop. All they do is constantly moving from one activity to the next. They fill their lives with all kinds of things, of commitments and their children's activities, and they just never stop. So when the day ends, they plop in the bed and they go to sleep. But if they don't, if you are busy, you don't have to think and you don't have to feel, and so that might be part of it too.
I think what triggered me in particular is giving birth to my last child.
Yeah.
And during that pregnancy, memories started coming back, flashbacks started coming back. And so
Right.
that was triggering, I guess, with her pregnancy. Mary, did you have something before?
I wanted to read just some statements from a woman whose first name starts with a T, who has had an abortion, and just ask you, doctor, if this is kind of typical. She
Okay.
said, I suffered from depression as a teenager, but after my abortion, I was now in full-blown despair and hopelessness. Now suicidal thoughts plagued me. Every time I saw a baby on TV, I would cry uncontrollably. My drinking worsened and I was a mess. I was trying to numb myself from the pain of my abortion.
Yeah, definitely. It's that's probably one of the more serious reactions, more extreme, but definitely consistent with the literature. The case with Stacey's Alley that I mentioned was similar, and that the big exposure to children, babies, triggering and causing trauma is entirely consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. And you read a lot about women who've had abortions just completely avoiding pregnant women and babies and all of that. And sadly, so few women really seek out help. And most of the help that's available is within the faith community, within pro-life organizations. Well, there are a lot of women out there, I think, who feel so bad about their choice to abort. They feel like God will never love them. A Christian organization won't be able to help them, and so they live in this sort of secular world alone and in shame. And then the mainstream mental health community doesn't recognize it. So where do they go? Well, then they start thinking about suicide because it feels so terribly hopeless.
Well, we just want to interject right here that there's always hope in the Lord. I mean, there's never a situation out there that you're feeling so hopeless in that there's not hope. There's always hope, and we encourage you to reach out to us, reach out to someone, because there's always hope. Trauma's temporary unless we continue to allow it to go on and on and on. Sometimes our circumstances, we don't see how we can get past the certain circumstance, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel. We just have to reach out and ask, and if we don't get that answer, well, that person reach someone else. But there are safe places for you. Operation Outcry is one of those places. Here at More to the Story, we're one of those places. There's so many pregnancy resource centers out there, so many abortion recovery programs out there. And even if you're not a believer, an abortion recovery program is going to help you go through healing. And they're all Christ-centered, because for me, I wasn't always a believer, but you're not going to get the total liberty and freedom outside of knowing that you've been forgiven.
Right.
That guilt, that shame, that pain, that regret, all of those things can be forgiven, and Jesus will forgive. And boy, does that take a burden off of your shoulders once you know that, and then being able to go through that healing process. And like I think I mentioned this last week or something when it married that, I was totally in denial how much trauma I was experiencing and pain and suffering. I just couldn't connect the dots. And so I was in so much bondage. But when I went through the healing, and it's not easy to go through, but every step brings you out of that darkness and out of that shame and pain. And then, it's kind of like me, it's kind of like going through a raging river to get to the promised land. And it's so worth going through that raging river, even though it's scary. You think you're going to drown. You don't think you're going to make it through. You keep persevering, you're going to get to the promised land, and you're going to know freedom and peace like you've never experienced before in your life. So I wanted to throw that in there. Mary, do you have another? We do always like to read some personal experiences from women.
I do. This is a woman that had a chemical abortion, so I'm curious from Dr. Coleman if she's the differences, if there are differences. This one said, I couldn't change my mind. It would make the staff mad. I was given RU486 to take in the clinic. They never told me it would starve my baby to death. They just said it would stop my pregnancy and keep my embryo from becoming a baby. They made it seem as safe as taking a Tylenol. They didn't tell me it was to induce strong contractions to expel my baby's corpse. Just it was necessary to ensure my abortion was successful. I took the second pill expecting what they had told me. I experienced very intense, painful cramps as my body expelled my baby into the toilet. A toilet. I wish I would have buried it. This abortion was harder. I aided in the murder of my child. I was told a pill was easier and safer than a surgical abortion. It's not.
Um, well, there's a lot of aspects to that story, but it's similar to the stories of so many women. There is data to indicate that women who have chemical abortions are less satisfied with the experience than those with surgical abortions, and they're less likely to ever repeat the experience. And a lot of the discomfort and dissatisfaction, in addition to the loss of the child and all that abortion involves, is the feeling deceived in terms of one symptom I remember hearing quite a bit in the stories is not expecting, and in published research, not expecting that massive amount of blood. So they feel like they're misinformed. They're not told they'll see a fetus. They make it sound so simple, and then they're faced with the reality, often all by themselves, because they don't want to tell anyone, or there's no one available, or they don't want to bother somebody. So they're by themselves in their home. They have to actually take the pill themselves. And they have to be alert, to be watching that the fetus is expelled and to make sure they don't bleed too much. And then often one of the difficulties is they aren't sure if the symptoms are typical or do they need to go to an ER. They can't decipher whether this amount of bleeding is normal or not. So it's clouded in all this misinformation. And when you look at the literature in terms of why women choose chemical over surgical, it's because they've sort of bought this myth that it's not really an abortion. It's just getting your menstrual cycle going. But it's an abrupt attack on your body. I mean, it's hard to just stop a pregnancy that's going, normally. And so I see chemical abortion as setting women up for a lot more trauma. I mean, it is any abortion that you are at much greater risk for having mental health problems. But if you go with the chemical abortion, those psychological experiences may be more profoundly difficult, and they may last longer. And things like your home or the bathroom becoming a place of trigger. People go home to escape from the world and relax. If you go home and that's where you aborted your child, how do you relax? And so there's just it just feels like we have almost like a tsunami coming in terms of suffering from chemical abortion, because it's turning out to be the method of choice, especially with several states now restricting, so women are going across state lines. And so, we're talking about at least 60, 70% are likely chemical now, and we can't assess that data because they're not tracked like the surgical abortions were. There's not, very rarely do women go back to an abortion clinic for counseling or help, especially when it's been chemical abortion. So we don't really know how many. The data on the physical complications is complicated because women don't typically return to the site where they receive care, that upset that they're going to go to an ER and it's not going to be connected back in terms of data that's reported to the CDC. And there isn't mandatory reporting in lots of the states. So,
and that was the whole reason for the FDA case, is because they moved those reporting requirements and safety hazards and or safety precautions. So, Mary, we had talked about a lot of shared several testimonies on the show of women who had chemical abortions. And what was the reoccurring theme?
Well, many of them thought they were going to bleed to death on their bathroom floors. Their own bathroom was the abortion facility, essentially. I know one woman, and I can't remember if she said it on our podcast, but I do know from having read her testimony that she actually had to pull her baby out of herself because the baby didn't come out. And I think that's part of the removal of the safety protocols. There's really no check and balance. So there's no doctor, there's no one checking how far along the woman is. And one of the people has said that I was, I think she was too far along. She was beyond the 10 weeks. And she told whoever she was getting her pills for the abortion. And they said, well, here, we'll just send you another batch. Just take another round. So it's like, I can't, this is just not healthcare. It's not healthcare.
No. And then again, a couple of things. If a woman does call the abortion provider where she got these pills, they're going to tell her if she's having a problem to go to ER. They don't want her to come back.
And that's if they're even answering the phones. I mean, if it's after hours, these women are on their own to try to figure out what to do.
Yes.
Another common trauma is that they see their baby. Yeah. They actually see their baby. When I miscarried, I saw my baby, and I took my baby back to my doctor's office. But and then I wanted to have a burial, but they wouldn't let me take the baby. But that's another thing, is that really, I think, like you mentioned earlier, increases the trauma, is that you're seeing evidence that it's not getting your period back.
There's a baby there.
Right. There's a baby. And doctor, one of the other things we encountered in preparing the brief for the FDA chemical abortion pill case in the U.S. Supreme Court was the women didn't know what to do with their baby. Some of them put their baby in the freezer. Some, reluctantly flushed the baby down the toilet, which is what many of them said they had been told. Some buried the baby in the backyard. Some, some stuffed the baby in the nightstand, like they didn't want to think about it. And so
that reminds me of a case I was on with Indiana with related to fetal remains, humane disposal of fetal remains. And so the state, required that the fetuses be separated from general medical waste and be buried or cremated. And boy, did the other side fight that. And I found studies that showed women think about what's going to happen to my baby's remains. That's important to them. And I think the problem with laws like that from the other side perspective is if you acknowledge the humanity of the fetus in death, you're acknowledging it prior. And that's problematic if you're pro-choice and abortion rights activists. And so, but women do respond to the remains, and especially when they see it.
So were you involved in that case then? Because I know there was a case from Indiana that went to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the U.S. Supreme Court said, yes, Indiana can have a law that says you can you shall treat human remains with dignity.
Yes.
This is really kind of the point of this.
Yeah.
And probably why women have trauma that are handling their own their own babies, their own deceased babies, is because, and not knowing, because there are regulations around what do you do with human waste.
Yeah, and I was on that case, but I also, in reviewing that, studying in the literature, I found that in some of the European countries, they don't even hesitate to do humane disposal of fetal remains. It's just like normative. I mean, you wouldn't even think about throwing them with the general medical waste.
Or even flushing them down the toilet. I mean, my goodness, that contaminates
the water system.
I mean, and I do remember that case. In fact, I was trying to think if I introduced legislation, or if I talked about introducing legislation here in Texas to look at that issue and have, a decent disposal of human remains, especially when it comes to abortion. And it's not just tiny babies. I mean, of course, we don't have it. It's not supposed to be legal here anymore, except for life of the mother and things like that. But, this is something that needs to be brought up in every state, especially with the rise of chemical abortions and so many women, disposing and passing their babies in the toilet.
Right. Well, And in the United States, that they tend to, we don't typically do um, the chemical abortion after 63 days, but in other countries, they do it through the second trimester because the protocol here, the most typical method of later abortions in the United States is dismemberment, and that live dismemberment. And I was also involved with the a late term ban in Indiana. I helped Utah and other states with gestational limits. But so these other countries do chemical abortion, because I assume because it's so abhorrent to dismember a baby, like we do here.
Yeah, it's totally different here than it is in most countries around the world.
Yeah.
Well, we're getting about time. I wanted to ask you, Dr. Coleman, how would you encourage a woman, or you went through some symptoms of post-abortion trauma and stress, and as a professional, what would your advice be to a viewer who may have had an abortion in her past and has not done anything, has not dealt with it?
Well, I would definitely seek help. Molly mentioned so many different agencies and organizations that have well-developed protocols for helping women to reassess the situation and come to terms with it and begin that healing journey. But I also would strongly recommend women who are in the decision process, haven't gone to the place of an abortion yet, to seek help because there are all kinds of organizations now nationwide that will help women with housing, with material needs for the baby, even with schooling, and all kinds of resources are available. And the decision should not be made quickly. It should not be made by somebody else. There are plenty of concerned individuals in virtually every community who can help you to think it through and look at your options in terms of help available. So,
right. Thank you.
It's also important to realize if you're suffering, you are not alone. That's I would say it's a normative response. It's not unusual. It's not odd.
Yeah, you're not alone. That's for sure.
Right.
We can testify to that. And there are financial support. I mean, pregnant women can get financial support in their state. Of course, we know parenting is always a really good choice, but there's not always that option for women. They may not be able to parent, but every state in the United States has what they call a safe haven law, and determining how long after you give birth, but you can leave your baby at the hospital. You can place your baby at a fire station or a police station. They have these little baby Moses boxes you can put them in. Everything will be safe, but you can walk away with any responsibility of taking care of that child, and the state will take care of it. And then the state will place that baby for adoption. And from the numbers that I'm hearing, correct me if I'm wrong, Mary, but there's way over 1 million couples waiting to adopt newborn children.
Yes,
for sure.
yes.
There's no unwanted children. Your child will be taken care of. And the best thing for me as a non-professional, I'm not a doctor, but I've experienced pregnancy and different pregnancy losses. The best thing that you can do for yourself and your child, your mental health and your physical health, is to give birth to that baby. That's what our bodies are designed to do, is to bring forth life, to give birth. And it's even whether you raise that child or you don't raise that child, and even if that baby passes, it's the best outcome for you mentally, psychologically, emotionally, in the long run. And because you can go through that natural process of either bonding and nurturing and parenting, or placing your child, or grieving if you lose a child, because abortion prevents you from the grieving process.
And Molly, is there time for one more point?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. We also do know if you're struggling with a situation where you're carrying a baby with a significant fetal anomaly, and that's about 3 to 4% of pregnancies, the mainstream medical community will often tell women this baby will not live, and that may be true. And so your best option is to terminate. That's best for you, and that's best for the child, to avoid suffering. Well, that couldn't be more absolutely opposed to the reality. All of the literature that I've reviewed for expert testimony work and for a review article I wrote suggests the opposite. Women fare far better when they choose to carry to natural death. And sometimes the baby will live for an hour or a few days, and then they're able to create memories. And it's a horrible, life situation to be facing the birth and the death of a child within days. And, no one should have to go through with that, but it happens. And the healing is much more productive and effective. There are organizations like Perinatal Hospice to help you to carry that child and to help the family create those memories, and the trajectory is so much more positive for women who go against the mainstream recommendations and just decide to carry to natural death. It's also safer for them physically.
Yep. Amen. Amen. I agree wholeheartedly with that from personal experience.
Yeah.
I haven't had fetal abnormality, but I have heard women who aborted from those reasons. They suffer even more because they felt their baby needed them even more so.
Yeah.
And they weren't there for their child. So
and they're often wanted pregnancies because they don't get to that point of realizing that there is some really unusual problem, a medical problem. They don't have that information till later. So most of these abortions for fetal anomaly are in wanted pregnancies.
Oh, and that reminds me, we're going to go a little bit over, and that's okay. So let's talk about the rape and incest. Do you have research that you can bring that up and how that may affect a woman's mental health?
Well, there's not a very much research on the experience of rape and the associate and how that impacts women who abort. There are a few studies, and so what we do know is that a significant percentage, first of all, it's pretty rare to become pregnant from a rape. We know that. But if a woman finds herself pregnant, a significant percentage choose life for the child anyway. So it's not an issue. And when there is an abortion, and when they choose life, there is one study I remember reviewing that showed the women did not have feelings. The vast majority of the women did not have ill feelings toward the child because the child was conceived in rape. So there wasn't that. Women are told you're not going to want to look at this baby. It's going to be a reminder. Well, that's not true from the data that we have. They often will attach and bond just fine, and some will give up for adoption. And the women who end up terminating feel doubly violated. So first they've experienced a rape, and then they've experienced the death of the child that they usually are pressured or coerced to go through this. So it's a really, terrible situation all the way around. We need more data on that topic.
Okay, thank you. Do you have anything you want to say about that, Mary?
I was just thinking, I've read a book, and I believe it's Victims and Victors, and it talks about women that have been raped and conceived, and then the difference between their own perspective, and by far discusses anecdotally there's not enough numbers for them to be statistically significant, but it does talk about in the numbers that by far the majority of the women, those that aborted were doing so to please others, not themselves so much. Right. And as you mentioned, and those that gave birth to their baby, whether they raised their baby or whether they gave the baby up for adoption, had much less regret and problems.
Yeah, and can you imagine a woman who wants to carry to term and then is faced with people judging her, thinking, "Are you nuts? Why would you want to have a rapist baby?" Or like that type of thing. So,
and that's the whole mentality of the abortion propaganda. Is like they need these abortions in cases of rape and incest because it's really society pressuring a woman in this situation to abort the baby because society wants to reject that baby. It's
Right.
not necessarily the mother.
And
And
then,
I've read that book too, and
Mhm.
women who conceived in rape felt like it was the only thing good that came from that negative experience. And
Right.
and I've heard women who aborted from rape saying that they were once a victim of a crime and they felt like they were a perpetrator of a crime by
Yeah.
a child. So it was a double kind of trauma. And I've heard one lady state that the trauma of abortion never healed the trauma of rape.
Right. It exacerbated it, I'm sure.
Mhm.
There have been some beautiful testimonies by individuals who were conceived in rape, and and talk about their wonderful relationships with their parents and how beautiful their lives are. And so God takes a tragedy and turns it into a miracle.
Yes.
There's so
Yeah.
many public figures, sports figures, singers, people in the arts that have told their stories that they were conceived in rape. So um, the whole outcome of this is that choosing life and giving birth is always the best outcome in a pregnancy.
It's really what the woman's body was designed to do.
Yes.
And it's what the science shows is most healthy.
Yeah.
It's most healthy. That is women's health care, true women's health care.
Mhm.
Yes.
So, Mary, is there any closing comments that you want to make? I know we didn't talk a little bit about the studies and the that they're trying to come after the research. Do we want to spend maybe
Yes.
a few minutes on
Yeah.
that?
I am curious about your opinion of the attack on the research because I know the Lozier Institute had studies that supported a position in the FDA abortion pill case that have been attacked really in the wake of the case getting into the Supreme Court. And what's your observation of studies?
Okay, well, I think the first study I published was in 1995, and so I've been doing this for nearly 30 years. And throughout that time period, I've seen a very clear bias in favor of publishing studies that show that abortion is benign. And so we have had to make sure our studies are very tight methodologically. They get scrutinized much more carefully, and so it's always been an upward battle to get these papers into the literature. But what we're seeing now is a major shift in terms of the level of attack, because instead of trying to prevent studies from ever being published, they're trying to remove studies that have been scrutinized, they've been peer reviewed, the editor has made the decision, and they've been part of our literature, and they're influencing cases, any legal work that involves abortion. And so, I do believe it's because there is such a massive amount of information out there that it's undeniable. When you look at the best research, abortion is riskier to women than carrying to term. And so there's a real incentive to cull the literature, remove the studies that are being used as evidence in court cases, to just take them out and retract them. If an article is retracted, removed from the literature after publication, a researcher becomes unreliable, and then it becomes difficult to serve as an expert. It becomes difficult to keep an academic job. It's about the worst thing that could happen to a researcher is to have articles retracted. But it's not really about the individuals. It's about the literature. If they are effective in removing studies by pressuring, a lot of pressure goes to these editors and publishers to take these articles out. And if they yield to that pressure, where the literature is not going to be an honest, the totality of the literature will not be an honest representation of how abortion impacts individuals and families. And so they have come after 3 of my articles. And fortunately, I have the financial means to hire a lawyer, excellent lawyer out of Cleveland. and I wrote a rebuttal. The most important one they came after with me was the meta-analysis that I published in 2011 and has been used in the foundation of laws throughout the U.S. and the world. I literally was all over the world the year that was published. And it's gotten all kinds of citations from other researchers. So the 18 pro-choice researchers wrote to the editor, I guess it's now 2 years ago, asking for removal without any clear reasons. Fortunately, that editor allowed me to write a rebuttal. I wrote a 40-page single-spaced rebuttal, hired my lawyers. 8 months later, the Cambridge Press decided against retracting. So I was affirmed, the paper was affirmed, it remains in the literature, but boy, did that cause a ruckus in England. Editors resigned, and the news coverage claimed things like they were afraid of a lawsuit. Well, I seriously doubt that Cambridge Press, the biggest publishing house in the world, is worried about some person suing them. It was ridiculous. And the reasons they gave were consistent with the science. They said, they wrote to me why. They said, it's been in the literature this long. There's been debate about it. They had a really reasoned decision to maintain the article, and so, but what a fight. And then as soon as that one was over, another one, as I'm in the middle of another, and we've been waiting 10 months for a response on another one. And then they did retract an article of mine from Frontiers in Psychology. But in that article was not like any of my other articles because it was a critique. It was a commentary of the Turnaway study, which was a large-scale effort funded by Warren Buffett, that they, out of the University of California at San Francisco, they generated over 60 journal articles from a highly flawed methodology. And I pored over that operations manual and all their articles, and everything I wrote in that Frontiers paper was absolutely the truth. And I had testified in court, so many different depositions and trial testimonies that it was true. But that Frontiers just took the liberty of removing it, never gave me a chance to argue for its merits. And then the reason given was that the reviewers came from the Leisure Institute, and that's ridiculous. They had credentials. And then, so anyway, I see that one almost as a positive experience because they just affirmed my thesis in the paper that there's bias in publishing, and so they just proved it through the retraction. So I'm almost proud of that paper with those big red letters that say retracted. And it's still getting downloaded. It's been read thousands and thousands of times. So it's a fight, though. It really is a battle. And we need to, as a community, I think, help the others defend. And that's one of the aims of the International Institute for Reproductive Loss, where I'm working as the science director. We hope to provide resources and like a team to help researchers who are facing this situation so that we can keep the literature where it belongs, published,
And that whole thing is really, it boils down to this. When you have an industry that wants to keep the truth out there, wants to keep the facts from being out there, who wants to operate in secrecy, or operate in lies, operate in deception, that's an industry that we need to oppose, and that needs to be brought down. And that's the abortion industry. They have never operated in the truth. They have never been transparent. They have never been factual. They have never given women data and correct information. And now they're trying to come against anything that would expose either their dirty works, or that would have the truth out there, that would counter their arguments, that would, expose them as being deceptive. So yes, if my Mr. Producer put on there the International
Institute for Reproductive Loss is a new foundation. We are working on the website. It will be launched soon. It's actually out there, but we're getting the content loaded. So I'll send messages to you, Molly, and Mary, and to other organizations when it's really ready for people to access that information. But yes, that We Care site was dead for 2 years. And then when I was involved in defending the Frontiers piece, all of a sudden it was up there, and it was not not my host, and it showed some of the Lozier people were affiliated with We Care, who had been the reviewers. So there was some maliciousness behind that, I'm certain.
Well, I'm sorry that happened, but thank you for correcting that, and we'll get that up there and make sure people have that access, or when you're ready to post the website.
I'll definitely let you know.
Well, there sure is more to the story, isn't there?
There's always more,
never ends.
especially when it comes to abortion propaganda. There's always more to that story, because they're only going to tell you what they want you to hear so that they can make money. In fact, I mentioned this the other night, and this is something that we really need to get out there. Planned Parenthood does not speak for women.
No.
They're a multi-billion-dollar sex-driven industry that profits off of sexual deviant behaviors and the consequences of that, such as STDs and abortion or pregnancy. And that's what they profit from. And they're not the spokesperson for women. So we need to make everyone aware of that. Yeah. So anything else, Mary, before we close?
Just sort of stemming off of that, I just heard a speaker who talked about Planned Parenthood being the biggest promoter and funder of transgender pharmaceuticals.
Amen. Consistent.
It's an evil industry. And I know I have a good friend from Canada who prefers to call them Planned Parenthood, not Planned Parenthood. But anyway, thank you so much, Dr. Coleman.
It was a pleasure.
Oh, it was so informative, and it was so good to see you again. Thank you for your good works. We're going to continue praying for you and in your new endeavors too. I'm very excited about that. And thank you, Mary, for co-hosting with me and being my right hand. And thank y'all for tuning in and listening. I hope you send us any comments you may have or any questions. Tell your friends about it, and be sure and tune in to us next time. And we're glad that you joined us here on More to the Story with Molly White. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.